Ruth chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Hear now God's holy, inspired word. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know. For there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction. The one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life, and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Well, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of God abides forever. Please be seated. Well, if you recall the last time that we were together going through the book of Ruth, we left off on quite a high note, the end of chapter 3, because hope was alive and well in the life of both Naomi and Ruth. We had a complicated and daring mission that Naomi sent Ruth on in meeting Boaz at the threshing floor. And the results of that mission, with Ruth's willingness to go along with it and obey the words of her mother-in-law, it turned out far better than both of them could imagine, because Boaz responded in a worthy manner and took to heart all that Ruth had requested and desired of him. And so we left off on a high note where the two of them are conversing together, and Naomi assures Ruth to basically play a wait-and-see approach. And her final words of assurance was that the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. So we see the two of them at the end of chapter 3 in hopeful anticipation, but they're still waiting on the reality to show itself. They're waiting on a conclusion. They're waiting on the matter to be settled. They have hope and trust in what Boaz said he would do. They're assured that he's going to do all that he possibly can, but they're waiting. They're kind of in a stage of angst. They're in that we talked about last time, kind of an already not yet. And so as they leave off the end of chapter 3 on a high note of hope, we see this anticipation of their glorious hope, of their anticipation of this full redemption coming to full fruition. And so chapter 4 serves us really in three ways. Of course, chapter 4 is going to try to conclude what we saw in chapter 3. Chapter 4 is going to conclude what we saw in the entirety of the book of Ruth. But we could even say that chapter 4 is going to tell us something important about the entirety of the Scriptures. So we might say it this way. Ruth chapter 4 has something to say about chapter 3, something to say about the whole book of Ruth, and something to say about the entire Bible. And when we think about the way that this chapter has something to say about the entire Bible, then we should be in that same kind of anticipation that Naomi and Ruth find themselves in, because we want to see what this has to do with the totality of God's Word. What part, even if a small part, what part does this story play in the grand story of what God is doing? And certainly we see, as Naomi and Ruth are waiting for their blessed hope, they're waiting for the appearing, as it were, of this Redeemer Boaz to come back victorious to settle the matter entirely. We're reminded that we're in that same spot as it stands as we wait for our own Redeemer, Jesus Christ, in his triumphant return. So let's consider it in two ways. Let's consider it as redemption accomplished in verses 1 through 12, and let's consider it as redemption applied in verses 13 through the end of the chapter. So it picks up exactly where we left off. Naomi and Ruth are speaking in chapter 3. Boaz is on his way to deal with this matter of redemption, and we find him essentially doing this either at the same time that Naomi and Ruth are having the conversation in chapter 3 or shortly thereafter. We're told that he goes up to the gate and sits down. And we'll see very shortly that this place where he sits down is where legal matters are dealt with. It's kind of the public square, if you will, but also kind of the open-air courtroom. It's where all of the legal matters, whether they're civil or judicial or whatever the case may be, are dealt with in this town. And Boaz is going there to find this Redeemer. And we're told it doesn't take very long, because as he goes there, basically waiting at the gate, you would perceive people coming and going. This is after the break of day. And he knows that this man that he's waiting on is sooner or later going to have to come through here and pass by, and I'll be able to find him. There's no such thing as texting him or picking up a phone to call him or anything like that. You just got to either search the whole city or go to the place where you know he's going to be coming and going. And so that's what he does. He waits there, and presumably it doesn't take very long, and this Redeemer shows up. Now we're told something very interesting in the very first verse, in that Boaz sees this man, and the ESV has it, "Turn aside, friend." This is how Boaz addresses him. "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." Now, if you were to do somewhat of a study on this phrase, you would find that the King James Version actually has it better, because Boaz says something like, "Behold, such a one." And in fact, if you were to do a word study on the actual Hebrew, you would find that what the narrator says is basically this: turn aside so-and-so, or turn aside such and such. In other words, what the narrator of the book of Ruth is doing is purposefully leaving out this person's name. We'll see why as we work our way further into this chapter, but at this point, you see a very conscious decision to tell us that here's the Redeemer. Boaz knows the person's name, but we're not told on purpose what this person's name is. And again, we'll see why that's the case as we make our way. But he sees the Redeemer. He tells him to sit down. Mr. So-and-so or Mr. such-and-such, sit down here. And he also takes 10 men of the elders of the city to sit down. So you have a quorum. We don't know how many people needed to be there, but presumably 10 was enough. So 10 of the elders of the city sit down, and the court is in session. This is going to be dealt with, this matter of redemption. In verse 3, it may sound surprising that the way that Boaz presents the whole situation is not what we have been anticipating this whole time. So far, if we were to follow the trajectory of the book of Ruth, it was about Ruth. It was about Naomi, of course, as well. But rewind to chapter 3, the previous chapter, Ruth goes to Boaz and asks him to make good of his reputation, to make good of the worthiness of his name, and redeem her. And he says, "As the Lord lives, I will redeem you." And now we get to this court in session, as it were, and Boaz presents the situation to this other redeemer, the one that he had already kind of warned Ruth about. There's somebody else that's first in line before me. He presents it to him in the presence of the elders, not as Ruth is in need of a redeemer, but rather Naomi is selling land. Now, this is a strange way to present the issue because we haven't been told anything about Naomi selling anything. This is news to us, as it would have been perhaps to others who were sitting by. Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. You might ask, what is he up to here? Why present it in this way? He says, "I thought I would tell you that you should know about it, and I would tell you to buy it in the presence of those sitting here. If you will redeem it, redeem it. If not, then let me know, because I come after you, and there's nobody else besides the two of us." Now, that phraseology is exactly the same as what Boaz had told Ruth earlier in chapter 3. He says in verse 13 of chapter 3, "If he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if not, I will." And that's exactly what he says here. If you will redeem it, redeem it. If not, I will. This, again, same kind of phraseology. But this time it has to do, so far, with Naomi and land. And so we might wonder, why is it that he has done this? Well, of course, if you study disputes of how to understand this whole thing, you'll find similar ideas to the degree that Boaz is here trying to trick this redeemer, that he's trying to set him up and get him to take the bait. Or maybe he has purposely withheld information thus far. He's just talking about a field, and maybe he's going to do a bait and switch somewhere down the road. But either way, we don't know anything about this field. We don't even know what the parameters of this whole situation are, really. But he says this in verse 4. The response of the Redeemer is this: "I will redeem it." Now, we're wanting a love story to have a happy ending. We're wanting all the boxes to be checked. We're wanting a nice bow on the package as we wrap things up here. And suddenly everything is in limbo because Boaz, Ruth, that match made in heaven, worthy man, worthy woman, we want them to get married. We want to see this come to a nice conclusion. And suddenly this other Mr. Such and Such says, "I'll be the guy. I will redeem it." And you have to imagine if maybe Ruth or Naomi, maybe their conversation's done, maybe they're kind of hiding in the distance, maybe they're peeking around the corner, maybe they're waiting to kind of hear how this is going to play out. And you have to imagine, if they're around, Ruth's heart had to have dropped to the floor because this was not part of the plan. This is not what any of us had in mind as we saw things play out in chapter 3. But Boaz isn't done talking. Boaz has only told him half of the situation so far. It picks up in verse 5. The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. So the idea is this. We don't know exactly what the stipulations of Naomi selling the land actually look like. There is several options, because if you go to the Old Testament laws, you will not see a nice, neat merging of their situation with what the law says. And so there's dispute as to whether is she even able to sell the land, or is this even a good way to present it? Because essentially the idea is you can't just sell the land off that belongs to the clan. It has to stay in the clan, and redeemers were not up to the task of, reaching into their pocket with a wad of cash or coins or whatever and saying, I'm going to buy this from you. There was no idea of a perpetual purchase of land. Instead, the idea is that Naomi is selling the land that belonged to her husband by way of saying she's forfeiting the rights to it, at least for a time. There was a whole stipulation about the 7th year of the land going back to the family, and so there wasn't this idea of selling it off to somebody forever. But the idea was that the Redeemer was responsible for maintaining the land, but they also got to enjoy the fruits of their labors. They got to make money off of the land. And so here's Naomi, an elderly woman. Here's what the family fortune is, as it were, land. And here's a Redeemer who is going to assume the responsibility of the land, use the proceeds to build their own wealth, and also care for Naomi, the widow. That's the idea. So they're not necessarily taking it from her. They're assuming responsibility and the benefits or profits minus the expenses that involve her. So that's the idea. And it sounded like a great win-win situation for this other Redeemer, Mr. So-and-so. He has the idea that there's not a great expense involved here. If all I have to do is just care for Naomi and the rest of it is mine, I could build my legacy. Presumably he's already married. Presumably he already has children. And the idea is that his family legacy is going to kind of rise and grow to a great reputation. Until Boaz tells him part 2 of the situation. Part 2 of the situation is actually the primary situation that we're concerned with, and that has to do with Ruth. Naomi is not of marrying age, at least in the sense of a redeemer fulfilling their obligations, because she's past the age of childbearing. And so Ruth, who is married to the next in line of her husband, Naomi's husband, Ruth being married to one of their sons, she is the next in line. And so the task of the Redeemer is to marry Ruth and perpetuate the family name in that way. Now, we don't know exactly why the Redeemer, who is not named, bails out at this moment. But when he's told this second aspect of his obligations as a Redeemer, he says, I cannot redeem it, verse 6, for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So he hears the whole plan, and he's starting to think, the cost far exceeds the benefit. Now it's not just caring for Naomi. Now it's promoting her husband and his legacy. And suddenly whatever wealth and prosperity that he enjoys is going to have to be divvied up not only with his own children, but now the children that he has with Ruth. And so suddenly he finds himself stuck in a difficult situation, and he says, I can't do that. And he forfeits the right. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, it's easy to point the finger at this Redeemer and wonder why. Why is it that what you heard so far was too much for you to bear? So far, we've been told that the whole town heard about the return of Naomi and Ruth. So far, we've been told about the reputation specifically of Ruth, that she is a worthy woman. And it could be said that what Boaz was trying to do was a bait and switch, similar to the way that people want you to maybe do something or they manipulate their words in a way to where you would think that it's your decision that you're making, but actually they're making the decision for you. Maybe an example would be if I know that I have a right to a vehicle, but actually before I can take hold of that right, somebody else is first in line. And so maybe I would go up to them and I would start off by saying, it's an awesome truck. The outside is Florida Gator blue. It's trimmed in orange. And they're like, okay, I'm on board. I'm going to get this truck. And then you say, but actually there's something else you should know. The interior is red and black leather with Georgia Bulldog G's on all the seats. And then you say, you know what? That's too much for me. I can't do it. And they bail out. Of course, we're not talking about trucks here. We're talking about Ruth and we're talking about the land. But the idea is Boaz trying to manipulate the situation? And I think the opposite is true. It's not that Boaz is trying to talk this other redeemer out of it in some way. Maybe he's thinking, well, this redeemer, he has racial concerns about Ruth because she's a Moabite, so maybe I need to remind him, hey, this is Ruth the Moabite that you're going to need to marry, and he thinks maybe he'll bail out because of that. But Ruth has already proven herself as a crown jewel, if you will. It's less that Boaz tells him the good news first and the bad news second, and more that Boaz goes from good to better. Because a man who thinks about the prospect of gaining Ruth as his wife would think that the gain of having this worthy woman would far outweigh any cost or expenses that I might accrue by kind of taking the package deal of redemption here. But instead, he hears about Ruth and he says it's too much. Now, you might also think that Boaz is protecting himself here. Suppose that all he talks about here is Ruth in the prospect of marriage and perpetuating the family name by offspring. And this other guy says, no thanks, I don't want any part of that. And then Boaz says, okay, fine, I'll marry her. But then he gets the family field and all of that. And you can understand that the other redeemer would come along and say, well, you didn't mention that about the field. You just wanted to talk about the marriage, but now you're just trying to increase your own empire. You're just using Ruth as a way to gain this land and to acquire wealth and all that kind of thing. So I think what Boaz is doing here is he's trying to unveil the entirety of the situation so that also everybody who's present will hear that what was the stumbling block for this man was the prospect of marrying Ruth, so that there's no dispute down the road. He's told the whole thing because he is a worthy man. We've already learned this about Boaz, and we're not about to find that he is not what the whole book has gone to lengths to show us. And so the Redeemer bails out, take my right of redemption. But before we see the finality of the whole situation, we're told something interesting here in verse 7. The custom concerning redeeming and exchanging was this: to confirm a transaction, one would draw off their sandal and give it to another. And this was the way to attest as a redeemer or to forfeit your right as a redeemer. Now, the interesting part about this is we've kind of seen somewhat of a preview of this already. Think back last chapter, Ruth meets Boaz at the threshing floor, and her instructions from Naomi were to uncover his feet. Now, of course, it's doubtful that he was wearing shoes to bed. It's more likely that she uncovered his feet with whatever blanket or quilt or whatever it was that he was using to keep warm outside in the open air. And as that cold air hit his feet, it's what woke him up and it's what prompted the conversation. But by doing that gesture, the first thing that Ruth says as he wakes up and is trying to figure out what's going on is she asks him to fulfill the role of a redeemer. And she's uncovered his feet prior to asking him to do that. And so it's a gesture, it's symbolic. We might say it's the sign in chapter 3, and now we have the thing signified in chapter 4. We have Ruth saying, by way of gesture, by symbolism, fulfill the role of a redeemer. And now we see him doing that. Except he's not the one that took his shoe off. It's the other redeemer. He takes his sandal off to make the gesture that my obligation as a redeemer, as first in line here, is now being exchanged or transferred or forfeited over to Boaz. That gesture of a redeemer. We have already seen it in chapter 3, and now we see it come to a head in chapter 4. Boaz says this in verse 9, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place." It's a beautiful picture of bringing all the anticipations of this book so far to almost a complete conclusion. What he says here is important because we see that Boaz doesn't simply see the role of Redeemer as something pragmatic. Well, it's just what you did in those days. It was just a matter of obligation and duty. But you can hear in his honor that he communicates that he's not interested merely in promoting his own name here. What he's interested in is promoting the name of the dead, Elimelech and even his two sons, Chilion and Mahlon. He wants to fulfill this role as a redeemer to the utmost. But there's also something we could say it's beautiful, referring to Ruth, because he says that Ruth he has bought to be my wife. You remember back at the beginning of this book, Ruth is presented as the Moabite. Ruth is a foreigner, and she kind of progresses by way of identity. She's a servant, she's a maid servant, she excels the ranks and the fields, but no longer in the story of Ruth, in verse 10, is she considered simply Ruth the Moabite, but she is now considered the wife, the bride. She has moved into her marital identity, and the thing that Naomi had wished for her beloved daughter-in-law has now come to pass. She wanted her to find rest in the house of her husband. She didn't think that was going to be possible by her decision to return to Bethlehem with Naomi. Naomi thought she was forfeiting all of that by Ruth making that decision. But here we see the noble, honorable man, Boaz, referring to Ruth now as his wife. Not only that, but to perpetuate the name of the dead. But another thing we could say is the way that Boaz signs off here in this book is by being a man of his word. You know, the very last phrase that we saw in chapter 3, uttered by Naomi, was this: "The man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." And Boaz's final words in the book of Ruth are this: "You are witnesses this day." He did what he said he was going to do. And we might contrast that by this other redeemer. Boaz said he would do it, and he did it. This other redeemer, in no less than 2 verses, changed his tune from "I will redeem it" to "I will not redeem it." So this other redeemer has his foot in his mouth. He lets his words get ahead of him. He's not reliable. He's not trustworthy. Boaz, on the other hand, did exactly what he said he would do. And the response of everyone here is fascinating, because in verse 11, we're told that all the people who are at the gate and the elders, so crowds that have probably assembled now to kind of see all of this play out, there's a group of people here and the elders that were already there within the inner circle. The response is this: it's a blessing. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem." Fascinating how they situate Ruth among the likes of Rachel and Leah. And of course, there's even more people that are mentioned, but I stopped reading. This was where the 12 tribes came from, Rachel and Leah's wombs. And they're saying, let Ruth live up to that standard. Let what she does with Boaz as a married couple, let their offspring attain to that. Now, that's pretty massive to say that, because your standards are very high, your expectation is very high, and you wonder if it's almost too much expectation here. But on top of that, what's said specifically to Boaz is interesting, because it says, may you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. Now, here's where our stark contrast really comes into play between these two redeemers. What we're told here, first and foremost, may you act worthily. There's that same word that we've seen as the descriptor for worthy Boaz and worthy Ruth, and it's the same word that's translated in Proverbs 31. We talked about the virtuous woman. It's this, they check all the boxes. They're the real deal. They're exactly and even more than what we could expect. They are worthy in that sense. And the blessing is, may you act worthily in Ephrathah. But the second half of that, and be renowned in Bethlehem, we might literally say it this way, may you make a name for yourself. Now here's the contrast. You don't have to turn here, but I was having a conversation with Steve not too long ago. We were talking about how there's that kind of refrain in this book of Ruth about the idea of worthy, or the idea of a virtuous woman, not only talking about Ruth, but talking even more specifically about Boaz. We were talking about how in the Hebrew Bible, the order of the Old Testament books is not the same as what the order is in our English Old Testaments. Because we understand Ruth, the way it's situated, as a nice transition between the times of the judges and then creeping into 1 Samuel, the times of the kings. It represents a nice transition in the history of Israel. But the books are arranged differently in the Hebrew Bible. One of the examples of that is that the book of Proverbs is what precedes Ruth. And so what you have, the ending of Proverbs, is a presentation of the virtuous woman, and then it goes right into Ruth, almost as if to say, here's your exhibit A of a worthy woman. But there's something even more striking to me in Proverbs 31. Because Proverbs 31 is not just about the wife, but it's also about the husband. Proverbs 31:23 says this, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. That's exactly what Boaz just did. He sat among the elders at the city gate. And the difference between Boaz and the other redeemer is that one of them has a name that we know, and the other one is never revealed to us. And that's kind of the thematic purpose here by the author of Ruth, is to communicate this. Boaz is the name you need to know, because Boaz is the one who made a name for himself. This other redeemer didn't rise up to the worthy standard that he should have. He most likely knew about this whole situation. He was first in line. He should have been the one to prompt this discussion altogether, not Boaz. But this man was unwilling to do that. He was unwilling to play the role of a redeemer as he was obligated to do. And as such, Mr. Such and Such is only known to history as Mr. Such and Such. But Boaz is the one whose name is known. And there's that blessing. May you be renowned in Bethlehem. May you make a name for yourself. May your name mean something throughout history. And that's exactly what we see in the case of Boaz. He has made a name for himself because he's worthy, because he showed himself to be an honorable redeemer. So redemption has been accomplished. And now, very quickly, redemption is applied, starting in verse 13. This is a grand conclusion, at least in the fact of knowing that Boaz is now playing the role of a redeemer, and everyone there is witnesses, and it's a done deal, never to be undone. But you might say, good that they're married, but the problem for Ruth was not marriage. She's already been married. The problem was no offspring. Great that they're married, but what if they can't have any kids? I might even add this. What if they're all girls? The family name still does not live on in that case. And we're reminded that the entity behind this entire situation is none other than the Lord himself, accomplishing his purposes. It is the Lord who gives conception to Ruth, and she bears a son. And I might just add at this point, that's all we're told about Ruth, because the rest of the story shifts immediately to Naomi. Catch that transition in 13 and 14. Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, I don't know if you remember this because it's been a few months ago when we were starting our journey through this book, that I said, as much as this is about Ruth and the book bears her name, it's just as much, if not more, about Naomi. And things have come to a nice full circle, we might say, because the story began by presenting the dire situation of Naomi. She loses the husband, she loses the two sons, and we found ourselves in that predicament of no hope remaining, and we're asking the question, what does this all mean for Naomi? The events have played out in the book of Ruth, and now we find ourselves asking that same question in a positive sense. What does this all mean for Naomi? Well, the women in the town saw this birth as something that meant something for Naomi. The women said to her, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in all Israel." So here's that son that Ruth has with Boaz, and this son is going to minister to bitter Naomi as a restorer of life and a nourisher of her in her old age. It's fascinating because back in the beginning, Naomi said something like, Ruth, if I could get married tonight and have a son tonight, I would do that for you. But chances look pretty slim on that. And plus you have to wait all this time for this son of mine to grow up until he's at an age that you could marry him. And it's almost as if this gesture of Ruth is to say, you couldn't get from me another husband, but I have restored to you a son. It's this beautiful gesture of that daughter-in-law who loves her. And we're told in verse 16 that Naomi takes the child and lays him on her lap and becomes his nurse. Now, this is open to a Pandora's box of interpretations of what this means. Is it that Ruth actually gives the child to Naomi and Naomi actually adopts the child? Is it that Ruth perhaps just lets her be a nanny? Maybe she gets, daycare privileges or something like that. But it seems that, for all intents and purposes, Naomi functions somewhat as a foster mother here, or almost as a godmother, or something to that extent. That this child is not just her grandson, but because of the very complicated situation, this son is almost a spiritual son of hers, if you will. Naomi takes the child and becomes his nurse. She cares for him, and he revives her spirit. He restores this life. He's a nourisher to her in her old age. And the town sees this as such a clear representation of a blessing for Naomi that they say this, a son has been born to Naomi. Nothing else is even said about Ruth for the whole rest of the book. And that's not because she was just a vehicle for caring for Naomi, but it's the idea that the whole story here is a story not only of hope restored in Ruth, but also hope restored in Naomi herself. And we find out, if we ask that final question, how is this child going to live up to the high expectations of, may this situation be something like Rachel and Leah. We saw the 12 tribes born from these two women. Maybe something as grand as that is going to happen as a result of this child's birth. And of course, The big idea in the book of Ruth is showing us that even despite the tragedy of the times of the judges and the surprising turn of events in raising up Saul as a king, that God is doing something prior to all of that. God doesn't raise up Saul as a king and say, well, let me go with plan B, David. But God has been orchestrating and accomplishing his purposes in the backdrop long before that. And this is the explanation of it. This is how David came to be, and it's nothing short of a miracle. We're reminded in that genealogy, those names find themselves in Matthew chapter 1 in the genealogy of Jesus. Talk about making your name renowned and living up to the worthiness of the blessing. You find your name attached to not only David, but Jesus Christ, who comes from the line of David. This story began with the tragedy of a clan that was on the brink of extinction and annihilation, famine, bitterness, hurt, hopelessness. And God restores all those things through the ministry of Boaz. It began with the story of a mother and her two daughters-in-law, one of them willing to go the distance, the other one counting the cost and turning back. It ends with two redeemers, one of them willing to go the distance, the other one counting the cost and turning back. But we're reminded that there are two that make a name for themselves, and that is Boaz and his wife Ruth, and they do so as a tremendous blessing to the widow and mother Naomi, who is restored. And of course, I mentioned as we consider this in its position not only in the book of Ruth, but the entirety of the Bible, we consider that our story plays out very similar to these two women. And I don't mean in terms of how many family members you've lost, but I mean in the sense that we had a Redeemer like these two women who rescued us from an estate of sin and misery and into an estate of salvation. Naomi and Ruth found themselves in sin and misery. They found themselves without hope, and God raised up a Redeemer to restore and nourish them. The same is true of us. When we think about Jesus Christ, we think about the fact that our name, as it were, was about to die out. That we failed to attain to the worthiness of being made in the image of God. That we failed to live up to what it means to be men and women created after God's image. And we're reminded in the story of Jesus that like Boaz, who is willing to make the names live on and not fade away, that our Redeemer writes our own names in the book of life. Our Redeemer restores us not only in name, but in privilege. And the grand privilege that we await is what the Apostle Paul calls the full intent of our redemption, and that is the redemption of our bodies. Our bodies cling to the dust. And Jesus, as we considered in 1 Corinthians 15, as we considered Job's own hope, that our hope of redemption is not just words. Our hope of redemption is not just a name, but it's our bodies being restored. That's the full scope of Jesus, our Redeemer, is not only saving us, but restoring our very bodies from the dust to glory. Jesus, like Boaz, has earned a name for himself. It's the name that when uttered, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. It's the only name under heaven by which men must be saved. It's the name that we utter our amens in and by, because it's the name of our Redeemer. We have a Redeemer who has made a name for himself, and our Redeemer has given us a name and written it in his book of life. Let us celebrate that, friends, and let us see that this book is not just a story about a man and a woman getting married, but it's a grand story that rewinds all the way back to Genesis 15, that God has promised to raise up an offspring and not let humanity die out. And he does so crucially at this moment in history, not only to raise up David, but to raise up David's Lord, Jesus Christ. Amen. Let's pray.